And thank you for coming to our talk here, a Zoom brown bag on the topic irrigation technology and women's empowerment in India. I'm going to share my screen with you so you can just see the slides that I'm going to be putting up. Okay. I wish I could have a peek at what everyone's having for lunch, seeing as though this is a Zoom brown bag. I hope people are eating. Anyway, thank you very much for joining us. Thanks to the Humanities Institute, especially to Adrian and Susan, for giving us a chance to informally talk about our research project from the ground up. In many ways, these informal talks are the most interesting and inspiring because we get to share our ideas and also learn from you. So we really look forward to your comments and questions. At the core, we hope that interdisciplinary perspectives in the sciences and the humanities will be useful, especially to our students who justifiably see climate change as the most important challenge of their lives. For my part, in this lunchtime discussion, I'll give you a very brief introduction to our research and talk about how just one idea led to a full-blown project. Then Jamie Sommer, my collaborator, co-author, co-conspirator, will tell you about what we initially thought we learned and how our views changed over time. And then finally, Christian Mark Schmidt, principal of a design firm, Schema Design, will talk about conversations that we find that emerge by combining storytelling and visual tools and analysis. So in approximately 15 minutes, after all three of our remarks, okay, we will invite your questions and comments. For me, this all started in the spring of 2016, when I just finished teaching 3 Asian studies courses: Women in U.S.-Asian Relations, Science and Civilization in China, and Ecology and Ethnicity in China. As usual, my students, who are from all over the world, inspired me to look in many different directions, and in this case, combine topics of women's leadership, science, technology, innovation, the environment and ecology in Asia. So I learned about a United Nations program that placed women in developing countries at the forefront of climate change, and really, this led me to contact the principals or the program directors or the creators of 4 different projects in 4 different countries: Thailand, Indonesia, India, and Vietnam, really to learn more about their programs. And I found through this that each of the projects offered slightly different visions of women's empowerment, which sometimes meant women having a voice in family decision-making, but at other times it required women take personal security risks as they become public figures. The one program that really stood out for me was an irrigation project in Gujarat. As you know from the program description, following a 2001 earthquake and massive flooding, an innovative program, Bhungroo, which means straw or pipe in English, used a simple irrigation technology to turn a humanitarian crisis really into an opportunity for village women in farming communities. The big challenge was that traditionally, rural women in India aren't permitted to own land, and so the Bhungroo program created a workaround strategy to give women rights to the irrigation technology and farm the land. The founders of the program, Trupti Jain and her husband Biplop Paul, both of whom have engineering backgrounds, by the way, wrote detailed emails and met with me via Skype, sometimes out in the field, to explain more about their vision and implement Bhungroo. Let's see, I should be able to, there, okay. So this is a visual, just very small visual that I can share with you later about what the Bhungroo project looks like in a nutshell, if you will. In formulating a research project, I then talked with Professor John Chandra in the Department of Sociology, who introduced me to Jamie, who was a graduate student at the time and helped me synthesize the scholarly literature on women and the environment. Jamie's now, not surprisingly, a tenure track assistant professor at the University of South Florida. Also, Professor Leonie Huddy in the Department of Political Science recommended that I learn about a theory of transnational advocacy networks, aka TANs, which could help me figure out how social networks both inside and outside of a geographical region could promote human rights, economic development at local levels. All the while, continuing to keep in touch with Trupti, Jamie and I then received an invitation from the Buckminster Fuller Foundation in Brooklyn, in which Bhungroo and Trupti and Biplop won the first prize for an innovation that empowered women. At the event, we received another invitation from Trupti for us to actually come to Gujarat to see how the technology worked and to interview the farmers. So Jamie and I proceeded to develop and refine our interview questions. We worked with interpreters in the field, and we ended up interviewing nearly 50 farmers, including those who had or were waiting for Bhungroo. And our purpose was really to understand, again, how the irrigation technology could improve women's lives and give them a greater voice. This is just a visual of how we kept track in various ways, both formal and informal, I suppose you would say, of the interviewees. On the one hand, because our collection is at the Stony Brook Library, we explained to the women and other farmers what we were interviewing them for, and they agreed to be interviewed and share their interviews with you and us. And then Jamie in the field keeping track of how many women, how many men we interviewed, how many had the Bhungroo, and how many were waiting for it.
In a little less formal way than having
definitely a little less formal way, but it worked. It worked. It was great. So once we conducted the interviews and returned to the United States, we wrote an impact report that the Agency for International Development, USAID, used to consider Bhungroo for additional funding. And we gave, as I mentioned before, all of our interview materials to develop a digital archive collection at Stony Brook University libraries. We actually began to imagine how we could use visualization, digital humanities, if you will, to reflect the many facets of women and climate change. In fact, when I talked with Christian, he saw great promise in creating a digital platform to present the project and our findings. So in preparing to use this platform, we recognized how to make the project better in ensuring, for example, proper translation of the interviews, assessing levels of education of our interviewees, and analyzing the benefits of Bhungroo. Well, to sort of finish my particular part of the story that Jamie will pick up on, as it turns out, this is really only the beginning of our journey for two reasons. First, we realized that the data we had collected in the field told a different story than what we had imagined. And second, thanks to encouragement from author and environmentalist Liz Cunningham, we realized that we had to look at what we learned in a completely different way, starting with a mind map, if you will, that Liz sketched out for us. Essentially, we had to develop new ways of thinking about and presenting our evidence. What was the hook? What was the list of obstacles? What were the key incidents and journeys and great quotes, and what are the top 3 questions we wanted to communicate, and so forth. So with that, I'll just turn it over to Jamie in a moment, though, just to remind you that on our next Zoom lunch, we're actually going to go do a deep dive into the collection, the digital collection, and more. Christian's going to introduce the platform that he developed, and we'll be talking more about that again in November. And if I have a little time left over, I'll click the link, but right now, I want you to really experience the story that Jamie has to tell you.
Thank you, Peg. So as Peg said, this brown bag is all about stories. And so I'm going to continue in that way to share more stories through our experience. So Peg just told us about how she found the Bhungroo project through its connection to the United Nations. And the United Nations was advertising the success of the Bhungroo project, and it also helped support the project. So the United Nations website told a particular story of success of the Bhungroo project. How a simple irrigation technology turned a humanitarian crisis into an opportunity for village women in farming communities, and how women became empowered by the technology despite their lack of land rights. So this story was really easy for Peg and I to understand. And the workaround strategy of giving the rights of the technology to women in lieu of land rights, that in fact Trupti fought the Gujarati government on for years as an employee, was intellectually exciting or curious. We knew the story had to be more complicated, but I mean, as always, it was really hard to see beyond our context. So when we finally got on the ground in the villages in Gujarat, we expected women to discuss how they have more control over the house's finances from the technology, how the technology gave them more decision-making in the home and in their communities. We also expected them to have more political participation in local government and in women's organizations. But why? So through this mind map process, we had to start deconstructing these assumptions. Why did we expect these particular things? Well, because that is what we thought from the United Nations stories. That is what we learned from the literature that we read in sociology and political science, in international studies in general. And it also fit neatly with the theories we were taught. But it wasn't until we actually got back to the United States and studied and discussed the oral histories with several colleagues and friends for literally years that we started to realize our bias. We thought we knew what the story would be before we actually heard the most relevant stories. Our stories from our context and lens taught us what was valuable, right? What was important, and what women's empowerment meant. It was like we had forgotten what we learned to value was not universal. Well, I'm happy to say that while we still hold considerable bias that privileges primarily Western elite and white views of women's empowerment that are steeped in capitalism and arguably reify the global politics of what is considered knowledge, we do now know how to better notice how these narratives creep beyond our critical thinking, and hopefully tell a less biased story of how this irrigation technology improved women's lives, not just materially, but also non-materially. And we're gonna share some of those findings now. But first, a special thanks to Alec Callie and Andrew Hargrove of Stony Brook University for their inspiration. So what we found. Well, before Bhungroo, the women reported having to travel extreme distances to get water for their homes, their farms, and animals. They had very little free time for the things they enjoyed, from their crafts to being with their families. Many also reported that their farms were unusable, that animals were leaving and plants were dying. They reported that many people had to migrate for work and sell things in the city, or take on manual labor on someone else's farm for their material needs, like food, water, and shelter. Through natural disasters and globalization factors that are also related to climate change, the farmers seems to be alienated from their work, their families, their communities, their environments, and from themselves. But after Bhungroo, something changed. The women reported not needing to travel for water, that animals and plant life were returning to their land, that their farms were coming back to life, that they were getting to work in the field with their husbands, that their communities had less of a need to migrate or do manual labor for others. They got to work for themselves again, more time for family. They had more time for community and their hobbies, and extra money to contribute to the household, which they were really proud of, and to buy themselves the things they liked, like jewelry. The Bhungroo repaired some of this alienation that they experienced resulting from natural disasters, globalization, and a long history of gender inequality shaped in part by European colonization. So put differently, the work of Trupti and Beeplap and all of their colleagues and supporters did to design this technology to be useful and relevant to the farmers, especially the women, exceeded all expectations. They made the technology in line with, what the farmers actually valued, and it got them more of what they valued, and thus it succeeded. Whether the United Nations, USID, me, Peg, or maybe you saw what they valued as valuable or not. In some, stories can contract or expand our values. And well, our greatest hope is that our collection can help expand others' values. And we hope your questions and insights that we're really excited about in this brown bag will continue to expand ours. Thank you.
Well, I guess that's my cue. So hi, everyone. I'm Christian Schmidt. I'm the founder and principal of Schema Design, based here in Seattle. And I just wanted to say, before I kind of dive into my part here, thanks so much to Peg and Jamie for including us in this project. It's really been a pleasure to help bring this study to life. And so I was going to take just a few minutes to talk about Schema's work and our process before then actually diving in and giving you a preview of the website that we collaborated on. If I can figure out how to screen share. So let me see if I can get this going. Okay. Oh, and that's actually where I wanted to end up. So I'm going to switch over here to that. Perfect. So just a couple of words about Schema. Briefly, we're a design and technology firm. Like I said, we're based in Seattle, and our focus is really on data visualization and data-driven design and experiences. And we believe that through data-driven design that we can help people understand complex topics and subject matter, really like this project, and ultimately help spark conversations. We think that design can become a catalyst for conversation. And so that's really what we aspire to do, to create these types of experiences through an honest representation of the facts, of the data, as well as then enabling people to really see and understand all of the different perspectives surrounding an issue, kind of a 360-degree view of a topic, essentially. And our projects typically, they span two categories of work. On the one hand, there are projects that are more about creating a narrative. Projects focus on explanation and creating stories using data visualization and digital design. And on the other hand, projects that are focused more on exploration. This is more about open-ended discovery, creating the tools that can help people find their own insights and their own stories in data. And the experiences we create, they really incorporate two primary, I think of these as layers of the work. There's interaction and interpretation. And where these two intersect, that's really our kind of core competency as a firm. And so on the one hand, users, audiences interact with data to find patterns and insights, while then the interpretive layer provides guidance and perspectives via multiple viewpoints to sort of help make sense of the data. And where these come together, we think we can turn information into understanding. And then these two layers map to two disciplines at Schema. On the one hand, data visualization, on the other, content strategy. Just wanted to talk briefly about these. When it comes to data visualization, we think about it in terms of three levels, beginning with an overview. So the overview is really about stepping back and being able to see the big picture. And it's also about understanding the boundaries, the scope really of the data set, and sort of situating yourself within that. Comparison then is really about seeing patterns in the data by comparing groups of data to one another, or even individual data points. And control, finally, is the ability to manipulate data, right? To actually apply filters, sorts, groupings, and even the ability to actually dive down into an individual data point and look at it closer in more detail. So we think of these almost as a Russian doll. they all hang together in terms of creating an effective data-driven experience. And then on the other hand, content strategy. And so this is about creating an engaging experience, an engaging digital experience. And here we talk about levels of depth using the ECR model, engagement context reference. So you start with engagement at the top, which is really about just pulling people in, creating that initial engagement through images, videos, information graphics, and also, strong headlines that can really generate that level of engagement. Context is the next level down, and really in many ways then the bulk of the experience. It's about presenting and guiding people through the information. And finally, reference is sort of the deepening of the experience. So here we can provide additional details and also resources that people can connect to in order to kind of continue their overall experience. And so for both of these models, you'll see hopefully how they are reflected in the website that we're about to show called Mirroring Hope for the project. Briefly about the process that we use. So, our process spans 4 main phases, and they both incorporate content strategy and data visualization. Starts with discovery. This is all about understanding the problem. And so here we might go and do an initial content audit. We might do different types of research as well, which could be anything from market research and looking at analogous experiences that we could learn from, and sometimes even ethnographic research where we would actually go out and talk to individuals. These could be, for example, end users or audiences that we're designing for. And then there's, of course, also an element of data analysis, so really understanding what it is that we're working with in terms of any given data set. From there, we go to design. This is all about finding the solution. And so design is then based on creating a content strategy, like we just talked about with the ECR model, and also an interaction model. So figuring out how to apply some of these principles to a digital experience via user interaction. And of course, visualization studies as well. So helping sort of understand what it is we're working with and identifying the solution. Prototype is the third phase. It's all about designing the outcome through visual design and various prototypes, visualization prototypes, software prototypes, and then finally build and refine, which is then all about implementation, but also testing and evaluation. And so, usually we have some form of QA, or in some cases even user feedback, where we will pull panels together of people to take a look at what we've built and make refinements subsequently then to that as well. In terms of the work, there's sort of a range of different project types. You know, some projects deal with explaining complex topics through a form of data journalism or data storytelling. Other projects are about taking research and white papers, we do a lot of these actually, and turning them into engaging experiences that can really captivate a larger audience. Some of the work is also about website design, sort of taking content-rich websites and re-envisioning them, rethinking them as scalable information experiences. Digital collections, so activating digital collections through fluid interactions and different views that can help you make sense of them. We also do a fair amount of media installations, which are more about engaging audiences usually in an ambient way within a space. And finally, this is also a good chunk of the work, is creating specialized tools for expert audiences. So for example, we do a lot of work there in the biotech space or even financial services, highly specialized application areas for data visualization. Great, so with that, I'm gonna actually switch over here to give you a preview of the website. Let me actually figure out how I can, there we go. All right, so this is it. I'm actually gonna refresh this so you can see the video playing there at the top. So it begins with really the overview of the project and some footage. You can see it playing there in the background as a way to really contextualize the work. From there, we can then start to scroll down and read a little bit of the introduction. There's Peg and Jamie on the side. And then we get into, this is really the context for the project, the Gujarat region and the villages that were included in the study. And so much, much of the work was really working directly with Peg and, to sort of figure out how to tell the story. And the mind map that Peg that you showed was sort of leading straight into that. Oh, and this is an information graphic showing the actual technology. So this actually, it changes as you scroll and gives you a way to see how the technology works. After which, it continues on. You can see some, beautiful images there from within the field, quotes from some of the participants. And then finally, at the end, it goes into more of a summary. So here we're sort of in context now, and then we're getting into reference kind of closer to the end, where there's a summary of the findings and also additional resources that people can connect with. And so that's sort of how it starts, contextualizing the project. And from there, you can go and click on the profiles. And so this gives you actually a way to look at the participants and in many ways the quote unquote data behind the project. And so here you see the full set. I think it's about 30, 40 people in total that were included as part of the project. And so you can actually, you can click on anyone here and read their story. In addition, you can actually look at them in a variety of different ways, sort of almost splitting the population in different ways by, for example, illiterate versus literate individuals. Gender is another obvious breakdown. Even total family members as well. So five family members versus more or less, depending on who it is. And are your children studying? So it gives you a way to look at the questions that were asked as part of the research, and who responded in which way. So that's really the digital collection piece of the project or of the website. And then the final thing really that I wanted to show is how you can then also connect to the data archive. And this takes you then to the Stony Brook libraries, which really include all of the sort of relevant qualitative information and data that was gathered for this project. And so from here, I can go in and look at the interviews, the photos from the field, related work. And so that, in many ways, this is also the reference piece, kind of connecting you to additional materials that you can use to inform your experience. And more on this to come, but I think I'll leave it right there for now and turn it back over to Peg.
Great, thank you. So that's great. Thank you, Christian. Really great. Loved it. I guess, and Jamie too, just great to pull these things together. We have one question that's come in from Rich Cronin. Hi, Rich. So nice to see you. And the question was, I think, very, very interesting. And that is, and I'll just direct this to Jamie, just because I can ask and you can answer.
Yeah, I can answer.
Which findings were the most unanticipated and broader implications for such studies?
Yeah, no, that's an awesome question. And I think that it really begins to sort of tie together what the three of us have been like talking about in terms of storytelling and storytelling through data, and how, you know, how we present data and how we interpret data can really change the stories that are being told, and can really share a different message that was than that might have been intended, or might echo, you know, previous stories, right? Or stories that we're most familiar with. And I think that a really good way of sort of thinking about this question is looking at, Christian, what you just showed in terms of how the little bubbles of stories can be sort of like sorted in different ways, right? And so really what that exemplifies is that, you know, the data aren't just, you know, interpreted by me and Peg from our own lens. They can be looked at in different ways, right? And folks can look at this and they can see patterns. You know, they can see patterns that we didn't see. They can see different things based on their experiences, right? And that's what I really found in the literature that was sort of unanticipated, right? So going back to sort of like the academic question, which findings were the most unanticipated? I mean, to be honest, when studying, you know, transnational advocacy networks, and when studying things in sociology, for instance, when we talk about non-governmental organizations, NGOs, especially local NGOs, there's a lot of criticism in the literature that, you know, they're very small in scale and scope and tend to not have a lot of resources. And so it's difficult, therefore, for such organizations to make a large enough impact on climate change adaptation and mitigation. And you can see how that question makes the answer framed in a particular way, you know, that of course one project, one NGO isn't going to completely, you know, change climate change. It's not going to make us be able to completely adapt to it. And so it's kind of not really getting at, you know, the value of non-governmental organizations, and also sort of presupposes that, you know, adapting and mitigating climate change has to be, you know, similar or broad, or help as many people as possible, or be very, very big in order to be valued, right? In order to be seen as like making an impact. And so that was something that I found really surprising in relation to the broader literature, because I expected a lot of the stories, at least from Trupti and BPLAP, right, to be about, you know, if we had more resources, if we had more funds, we could help more people. And while they did say that, and while they could benefit from more resources, they're expanding in scale and scope beyond what, you know, I think a lot of folks think is possible in terms of the operating budget. And they're, you know, helping so many people. But that's not really what that project was about. And that's not really what we learned at the time. So put differently, the contradiction between what is important in like a dominant literature in a specific area, like sociology, for instance, and what you actually find in the field.
Yeah, I think just to add to that and then answer, and I'll answer the next question, we struggled with the idea of what you meant by empowerment, because we kind of thought that empowerment, we were gonna go out in the field and we were gonna find these women who were, you know, like directing, you know, projects and, you know, really very vocal about their leadership roles. And then we found that they were glad to have extra money to make crafts. So what they wanted and what they needed was very different from what we thought and what's in the literature, certainly, about empowerment.
At least the literature we were reading, the literature that is dominant that we were exposed to.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. There's another question that I think that's really interesting, and that's from Shabnam. Hello, Shabnam. And that is, are you thinking about expanding the project further to other nations, Bangladesh, for example? And the answer is yes, not only us, but first of all, Trupti and Biplop have been asked by various countries, including Bangladesh, Indonesia, Vietnam, and now we're working with them to try to see if we can't get some applications in Africa, in Kenya in particular, because Stony Brook University actually has a Turkana Basin Institute, and Turkana County really seems to be a place that could benefit. We've been working and talking with the people in the Turkana County in Kenya to find ways to introduce this, because there are about probably 13 or 14 or 15 or how many very different applications or different ways to use the technology. Let's see, to take us back to the underpinnings, Sue Badeckheimer says, hi Sue, can you tell us how the irrigation technology works? I guess the best way to do that is to show you again, Christian had the visual, but I'm going to go back and see if I.
You want me to pull that up again?
Yeah, maybe you could. That would be great.
Yeah, let me do that.
Because that took a lot of time, not only for the design crew, but also to really understand how it works. So it's a design that is intuitive. In fact, one of the things that Biplop told us that was really pretty interesting is that women intuitively knew how to use this technology, because they're the ones that are out there storing the water, collecting the water, and they know how to measure the groundwater and so forth. So
no one had to be taught anything in order to use the technology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Sue, it's a pretty simple engineering concept, and basically what people have to do in the field is they have to first go and measure the salinity of the ground, and see which type of, how to install the Bhungroo and what kind of design is best, based on whether it's a matter of too much water, too little water, when it comes in, when it's needed, and so forth. Does that help answer the questions a little bit? So there's the underground aquifer.
Mm-hmm. I think we also there's a section of the video that shows it as well.
Oh, right.
It's just it's in the background, but yeah, I'll let it play so you can see.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, essentially it just I mean, in my sociologist view of it, right, I'm not an engineer, but essentially what it does is it, stores water during wet seasons and holds it. And then, so that water can then be used for dry seasons. And also that helps prevent flooding and stuff, right? Or helps reduce flooding because the water has somewhere to go, and then the land doesn't dry out as much, and then you don't have as much like desertification. And so the land can sort of, you know, function better with this additional unit.
Right. Good, thank you. So if you have more questions, you can certainly put them in the chat box, or if I can see you, and sometimes it's a little tricky to see so many people, or if anybody else can see you, I'll just raise your hand and I'll definitely unmute you and let you go. Okay, so there's Rich. Okay, there we go. Hi, Rich. Oh, didn't work. How can I unmute you? Let's see, wait a minute. I'm not unmuting. Adrian, can you help unmute Richard?
I asked him to unmute, so he has to unmute on his end.
Okay. Okay, we still can't hear you, unfortunately. Is there a way to do that? Okay, there you go. Maybe you do it now.
Yeah.
Yep, we can hear you.
Great, thank you.
Let me, if I can, just follow up with 2 points. One is about my first question. I was thinking more about, well, maybe you answered it, Jamie.
Yeah.
Well, maybe you answered it, but it was about. So, what were your presumptions to start with? And you ticked off a list of things that you were expecting, or before and after things, and then, but it was a little confusing about what was really new. You know, you have your list and you check that off, yes, no, yes, no. What was really new, you know, beyond that. I think you've answered it adequately, and I'll follow up myself just in looking at your work. But the other is about this Bhungroo technology. I had 2 years of engineering before I did economics and history. But the main point is that those units don't look that big or that deep to catch that much water. And so it seems what's critical is that if everything is covered, then what goes down the tube into the aquifer, you know, I guess would depend on how long the water is up there. But as for as actual storage, it doesn't. I think you'd have to put them all over the field to get enough. That's my question. Maybe it's just I don't know enough about the technology, and but also is how is it the women? If it's not that complicated, how is it the women get to be in charge of this thing? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. So it is one of the things that is pretty challenging is that Bhungroo has to have people who come out into the field, managers of the technology, to make sure that it's working and installed correctly. Because we did find, in fact, some cases in which it wasn't quite working the way that people thought it was going to work. And so it was a matter of refining and retooling that. And so I don't know if it's really putting it all over in the field as to kind of guesstimate or understand through looking at the ground to see how much is needed for that. But that's why actually as time has gone on, Biplop and Tripti have developed, I think, 13 or so different designs depending on the ground. So that's a really, really good question. And something that's very important. And then about how women became part of this and why women. I think it was because women were at the bottom of society, especially in these regions. And so the idea was to try to figure out ways that you can inspire women who have the most to gain really from the technology. So to be able to train them was really the most significant part of that. And it involved very simple things like taking a measuring stick and, you know, measuring how deep the groundwater was, or, you know, so it wasn't real complicated, but it was significant that they got to do it. And another reason that is important too is because in times of economic crisis, especially in these rural villages, men migrate to other regions to get, as Jamie said, to work on other farms. And so the women are kind of left, essentially, and they need to figure out how to really run this project through. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Okay, great. Let me see who else I have here. Okay. From Jay Rafelson. Hi, Jay. How much land does one unit serve? And how do the farmers get to the funding for their installations? Great. I don't know the answer to the first question specifically. I think it depends on the project in terms of how much land one unit serves. But Jamie, do you want to take the second question? Do you know do you know how to frame that? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm talking too much.
Yeah, no, and there are also bigger and smaller Bhungroos, right? And so it would sort of depend on that. But yeah, we don't know the exact answer to that. But we can find out for you. So we'll ask Trupti and she'll know. Yeah. How do the farmers get the funding for their installations? Yeah, and so there's a couple of different ways. And so everything is sort of housed under Narita Services, which is the local non-governmental organization that Trupti and BPLAP started. And then the Bhungroo technology is like the technology used in that organization. And so, you know, the organization raises funds to get the materials to install Bhungroos in different areas. And so what they usually ask for, or what they decided from when Trupti was telling us, is that they went to areas that they felt, villages and areas that they felt were most negatively impacted by climate change issues, or had really big changes in migration patterns and things like that. And then they basically, you know, asked for, you know, a sort of reasoning for how the technology could help them. And so they worked with other people in the area to sort of create like a type of application for farmers to then give to the Bhungroo, to give to Narita Services to sort of like go over that to see. And they would get, I remember them talking about all of these applications that they got and how there's so much unmet need, but how every day that goes by, they get to just do more and more. And so so Trupti is obviously working on different funding initiatives and different ways to try to, you know, pay for these technologies so that they don't cost the farmers anything. That's the goal, that like there's no need to take out like loans or anything, because a lot of folks actually already owed money, were in debt. And so they didn't want to like compound that issue. Right, Peg? What do you want to add?
Yeah, two thoughts I had when you were talking about that, Jamie, was that there is really an issue in this area of as well of suicides among male farmers. I think you might have read some articles in the New York Times about this as well. It's pretty, and a lot of this is kind of wrong, from what BPLOP explained to us, is a bit wrong-headed, because they get into debt, not from the Bhungroo, but from other, you know, trying to just keep their head above water. Well, that's kind of hard way to say that. Sorry. But they have to, they think that if they kill themselves, that then the state will take over for and take care of the family members. And this is actually not the case. In fact, what happens is the women and children become indentured servants, or, you know, are sold into, you know, essentially slave labor. So it's that BPLOP and Trupti are very aware of the need for making sure that the farmers aren't paying for any of this if they can, and that's why they have the applications for funding.
And so they try to raise funds through, like you mentioned, like USAID, that's, I mean, the United Nations, how they were actually like featured on the United Nations Momentum for Change Women for Results website was because Troop Team B Block applied for an award for the Momentum for Change Award through the United Nations, and they were awarded that. So the United Nations Gender Development Team, in specifically, and Peg knows all those folks too, and we've talked to them. They basically like started like a media campaign for Troop D and BBLOP and Narita Services. They helped with the website. They did like on the ground capacity building and things like that. And like they were already like winning grants before that from, for instance, just the government of India, or more like local branches too. On their website, Narita Services, you can see all of the different awards that they've won, and we'll make sure you get that website too, but all the different grants they got, all the different awards they won, all of the different like notorieties they've gotten for their awesome work, like way before, you know, they were even featured by the United Nations. So
Yeah.
there's all that history too.
Right, and I just want to give a shout out to some of our Stony Brook University students as well, because one of the things that, as we were planning a symposium, a scholarly symposium around this project for spring, which obviously didn't happen yet, one of the students that I was working with in the program for writing and rhetoric, who is in medical school now, looked at the Bhungroo project and she said, I don't think they should have to pay anything. So how do we make it so that they don't have to pay anything? And so she actually developed a research project, and it's a little bit detailed to get into now, but she combined this notion. How many of you have heard of carbon credits? Have you heard of carbon plus credits? It's based on that concept that somebody in the United States, a student or a student group even in the United States, could actually set up a fund, and when women in the field in India show that they've used the technology and that it's effective for them, they gain points. And so when they get points, then the points are transferred back and they get then more funding for the project. So I just think this is an important component of the project, that it's not just, it's really students, you know, how people are trying to make a difference, how they're trying to look at this climate change issues and trying to figure out how in the heck they could help. And I think this is really an interesting example. We have a question from Rita. Thank you, Rita. And are you going to other places in India? And if so, the need for Bhungroo may change, right? It is, and then she asks, is it similar to microcredit? I think it is somewhat similar to microcredit. And yes, the program has gone to, I think, 7 different states in India. We wrote a paper on this and talked with Troop D and BBLOP about the various states in India. And again, it depends on the saline levels and so forth as to how to install it. The second is from Sarab. Hi, Sarab. From my Writing 102 class, yay. Usually in rural India, farmer borrows the money from local financiers for the installation. It costs them around 20 to 25,000 rupees. Yeah, and this is a problem, and this is what we're trying to.
And that would be an example of microcredit, right? And so if there's sort of like a small amount of money that you borrow, and then you then do something with that money, and then you pay some money back. And I've read not very deeply about microcredits, but from what I can gather, they often tend to be a trap, right? They trap folks in debt, but they can also be, you know, a beautiful opportunity for like having some funds to move forward. But I've been a part of a literature that sees a lot more traps and inequality resulting from these things than everything else. But we have seen some projects that actually do use this sort of like pyramid-like microcredit you know, way of managing money. and they seem to be more successful. Like Jeanette, for instance, Peg. Maybe we can provide some more links on that too.
Right. Yes. Jeanette Gurung, also a recipient of a UN award, developed this, what I was referring to as similar to the carbon credits. She calls it the W+ standard. And she worked and tested her work in Nepal, by the way, to try to see how this could work in giving people, the money that they would need for that. I think there are lots of different ways, and it is important for people to figure out ways that they can make a difference on whatever level they want. So let's see, microcredit. Rita says microcredit has really empowered rural women in Bangladesh.
Yeah, I'd like to see those examples too, because like I said, like I feel like I've just been keep reading these things of like, oh, it's a trap, but like we know from our other projects that like it's been really awesome and helpful in a lot of cases. So I'm looking forward to seeing whatever information you could give us on that. That'd be great.
That'd be great, Rita. Thank you. And Rich says, at what levels, if any, are national, provincial, district levels of government involved? Is this something that would have political appeal for government funding? You want to talk about that a little bit?
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great question. And so like I mentioned in my monologue, or whatever you might call it, Tripti did work for the government for a long time. Well, like 20 years, Peg, or something like that. And she, was trying to do many things. And one of them was trying to get land rights to women. And, she basically knew her government in and out at that point, and sort of knew or really was able to develop a sense of like what she could change and what she couldn't change. And so after all of that experience, she, started Narita Services in an effort to sort of like, change what she could change and, really give back to her community in all the ways it gave to her. And so there are, national and also more local levels of government involved, and that helped fund the project. And there was also times when the government chose to not fund her. Do you remember that, Peg, where it was sort of this like evolving story where she had this amazing proposal and then she brought it to the government of India, like the specific area, and they were like, nope. And then she kept winning all these awards from like outside and like, with all of her connections to the US, like where she went to school and like all of that, she was able to, start really making a case for this project, and then really started getting government money more and more. But in my understanding of her story, it didn't seem like very, very much, right, Peg? And it was mostly from the national government, correct?
Yeah, there is the local government seat. I think it's called the Panchayat. Rich, is that right? Is that how you pronounce it? Because I know Rich is a India specialist. And one of the things that was happening was that Tripti found was that there were seats that were dedicated to women. You have to fill so many seats, but they were just populated with, essentially, dummy candidates. Sorry about that, but and so it wasn't effective. And so that's really interesting. And it does get back to this idea of the power of transnational advocacy networks, because I looked at several. I think John Chandra actually sent me several memorandum of understanding that talked about different agreements that governments had signed off on, saying that they were going to pledge to do this for the environment and that for the environment. And so it's really, having those outside pressure, if you will, ways to work around things. And that's why the strategy is so brilliant, because it is not only working around the political levels, but also working around the cultural levels of, you know, women not traditionally being in roles, you know, and having control, but being able to have control of the technology, even though they can't have control of the land. Okay, Sarab, every year the central and state government allots a huge amount of budget for the equipment of farmers. It's helping the farmers in a huge manner, but still every farmer isn't getting the funds directly. There are several districts where corruption exists. I remember Trupti talking about also the recommendation that came from the national government to, for example, dig ponds in the,
Yes.
and the women said, that doesn't make sense for our community to dig ponds. That's not what we need. So that happens everywhere, where you get somebody from a larger entity telling you what you think you should have, and, you know, absolutely not, is hard. So, and Adrian says, it's actually not dummy candidates, but paper candidates. Right. I was using actually Biplop's words when I was talking about that. And yes, it's Panchayat. Sarab mentioned this system was ended in early 1980s in India, but it still exists in several states, which is where the corruption takes place. Wow, what a great, interesting set of questions and thoughts that you guys have provided. Anything else that you would like to mention or talk about? We'd really love your ideas. Okay, so from Craig, how is the Bhungroo system superior to contour swale irrigation, which may cost much less? One of my students in Writing 102 actually did an evaluation of different types of irrigation systems, and I'm not able, I don't have the engineering background to be able to tell you that, Craig, but how about if I ask Trupti and get the answer to you?
Or if anyone in the audience happens to know and wants to chime in.
Anyone in the audience happens to know. Okay, great.
I have a question for Christian.
Great.
So like, so your company, Schema Design, you know, as we know, doesn't just do like academic stuff or data. And, you know, one of me and Peg's, and so one of me and Peg's passions is, you know, having open source data, like open source interviews, open source oral histories, like really creating, you know, a space where, you know, academic stuff isn't behind a paywall, or, you know, presented in a way that's like accessible and awesome for whoever might want to access it. And so I'm wondering, like, you know, how do you see like education, or like us perhaps as academics or as universities using like your skills to sort of like tell stories through websites that are more interactive and maybe more interesting to students?
Yeah, great question. Thanks. Well, I guess through projects like this one, right? I think, well, one thing I should maybe mention is that the website that I showed earlier, you know, is based on a framework. It's based on a technology platform that is extensible. So you could actually plug in other types of content as well. And you can, I think there was a question earlier about maybe, you know, continuing this research. And so potentially that collection, that digital collection, could grow with additional results as they come in. So anyway, just wanted to get that out there. In terms of how, yeah, I think that's a good question. We do work with a lot of academic clients. Actually, we have, for example, a long-standing relationship with the University of Washington here. And, you know, I guess these projects, you know, they're typically grant funded, of course, and they're often actually based on open data, I should say, as well. So our role, I guess, I mean, I could have, you know, maybe for next time I'll show some examples. But there was one project actually that visualizes bills data, bills and, you know, as they're introduced into Congress. We actually have one now for Washington State as well. So that's been interesting. But yeah, it's, I guess, how would you work with us? There's sort of many different ways, but it usually starts with, you know, maybe there's an existing data set or an existing project. You're thinking about how could we take this information and make it more accessible to a larger audience of students, of educators, even a mainstream sort of public audience as well. And then we can come in and, you know, I talked very briefly about our process, but we would work with you to sort of figure out how to present the information. We often do workshops as well. So to sort of think of the, you know, we think of the design process really as being very inclusive. And so it's about really assembling, you know, the right stakeholders. And, you know, we sort of come in as facilitators almost, and then together we can kind of craft the vision for the experience, and yeah, and then ultimately end up implementing it. Is that what you meant, Jamie? I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Yeah,
but
that's exactly what I meant. And so,
yeah,
you know, it's just like another medium through which we can like learn and teach. And
yeah,
it's like a great, you know, a great link to, you know, we're doing a lot more online teaching these days.
Yeah.
At least I am. I don't know about everybody else, but you know, and that's really a sort of way to complement any other material that through visualizations, different types of learning can occur, you know, and you could hear stories in different ways and actually move around the little bubbles, you know, like in your little drop down, and really figure out the story from your own perspective.
Yeah, and actually just one small thing to add there, I do think there is huge potential in the space of digital collections, actually. And we, you know, in addition to universities, we also do a fair amount of work with collecting institutions and museums. And, you know, obviously they have, often they have digital collections as well. And so I think some of the opportunities there's maybe two things to say. I think one big opportunity space is linked data. So linked open data. What happens when you take various collections and look for the kind of relationships between them so that you could link up different data sets? That is, I think, a really, really interesting avenue to explore. And not that much work has happened there yet, but it's just starting. The other thing on the bubbles, actually, I think it's worth saying, yeah, I think it's worth noting that I think, so I was talking about data visualization, and I think typically what people imagine, right, is charts and graphs. We do a fair amount of that too, to be candid, but I think where the real value is ultimately, I believe, is in actually representing individual data points, kind of like we did with, you know, with this set of people as well, the bubbles. And the reason is that you're removing a layer of abstraction, right? As opposed to looking at maybe a bar graph or a line graph or something like that. There's an implicit sort of layer of abstraction that you've introduced. But if you go down to the foundation in some ways, which is the individual data, the measurements and the people and the, you know, the events or whatever it was that you were tracking, then you can really let people apply whatever lens they're interested in to find the stories that they care about, and also form their own perspectives on it. Yeah. So I really believe that there's big potential there. Yeah. And
then it like reduces, you know, the psychological distancing, right? Like there's less steps between like you and this person's beautiful history, you know, that you can sort of like learn and go through in this way. So I really think it's like an empathy building like tool as well. Really make those connections.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah. Looks like we have another question.
Let's see. Okay, do you anticipate or think that these visualizations can be used to demonstrate impact to key stakeholders to get more funding? Thanks, Em.
Yeah. I'm not sure if that's directed at me or anyone else, but I mean, I certainly think so. And, you know, just speaking from experience, a lot of clients actually do come to us for precisely that reason. where it's on the one hand, of course, about engaging a broader audience, but then also, using it for the purposes of fundraising, and in some cases even engaging policymakers more in the materials so that they might become advocates for the project or whatever it is. So yes, I think that's for sure. Mm-hmm.
Or even for boards of directors of different companies to build advisory boards and support that way. That's great.
Yeah.
And it seems to be a technology, or like through the website, right, that might actually be able to represent the material complexly, right? Like you were talking about, and like we've been talking about this whole time about stories, we often, rely on like essentialization, or we essentialize things in order to make them, understandable or like relate to the widest audience possible, depending on who we, think our audience is. And I think, well, not perfect, right, but certainly getting better. I think your designs and websites and I think the way these data are presented can, in a lot of ways, like really convey the complexity that some of our, previous methods of doing so fail at or aren't able to do as fully. And I think it gives a lot more justice to the complexity of the world and the data, and what activities are actually taking place. I remember USAID decided not to provide additional funding to Troop DJ and BPLUP for one of their grants, with some sort of understanding that they didn't count like the particular amount of water that was gained or something very technical, right? And I remember me and Peg looked at that and we were like, if there was a way to convey some of this other information, some of these other benefits, maybe something different would happen. And I think this is a perfect example of where something different could have happened.
Yeah, I think that's true. And the other thing is we're looking at it from different lenses as well. I mean, so the USAID was looking at numbers and we were looking at people and stories, and both are important, no doubt. But the idea of having both of them is really significant. Let's see, Alphonse? Oh, shoot, it went away. Okay. Beyond women empowerment and the mentioned reduction in migration, are there other social and community changes that can be attributed to the project, like changes in traditional family structures, for example? What do you think, Jamie?
That's an awesome question, Alphonse. And,
Great question.
Oh yeah, no, it's a really good question. And that was like, I mean, that's still our question, right? And so, we're gonna go back. We were supposed to go back sooner, but the world and everything. And from what we could tell, in this particular region of Gujarat, in these particular villages, they have sort of a hierarchical structure in terms of like the oldest male in the family sort of like controls the finances and the household decisions and things of that nature. And we don't see that changing at all from the Bhungroo technology. That is firmly entrenched in most of the households that welcomed us to talk to them about their experiences. But what we did notice was, and I mentioned this a little bit when I was speaking before, about how women, given their like control of the technology or ownership of the technology, they were able to make like their own money, which then they could contribute to the household. They also, had more free time to do things they enjoyed, like their different crafts and other hobbies. And then they were able to also make some money from that process too. And so then they could make other contributions. And so while I'm like, worried about the traditional family structure in that, I think women expressed in different ways to us that like they have like got a lot more involvement in the family structures. They have a lot more engagement in those structures from Bhungroo, though it's hard to tell or say. What do you think, Peg?
Well, you know, as you were talking about that, I was thinking about two things. One of the projects that that USAID wants to be done, I don't know when it will be accomplished, is something on gender-based violence in these areas. And I was wondering if maybe, you know, that's such a great question, Alphonse, is that I wonder when you do interrupt traditional structures is if there is something that happens that is not necessarily a positive. And then the second thing I was thinking about is, I remember Biplab telling me that in some areas of different states in Gujarat, he's actually from Bengal and does a lot of work in different regions. He said that that there are some areas in India, some districts in India in which men are not educated. They can't receive a higher education, and they often feel very disenfranchised. And so, while it doesn't directly relate to women, the thing about the irrigation technology is that he's trying to set up situations in certain areas where men, young men, can be part of the process too. So it's not just relating really only to women. It has to be a whole community that is involved in that. Boy, that's a really great question. Thank you so much, Alphonse, for that. Let's see, Rita said something about visual rhetoric, and it has a tremendous effect on illiterate women. And yes, indeed. I mean, that's
and sharing videos with the women too, Rita mentioned. Or you could share some videos with the women.
Definitely a great idea. Thank you. We will. And let's see. Oh, yeah, I think that's anybody else? Did I miss a question at all? I think Sarab was able to answer the question about the swale irrigation. That's great. Thank you, Sarab. Anybody else?
We have about 8 minutes left.
Okay. Well, this is really, really engaging. Thanks so much. If you have any further questions or anything that you would like to know, I would like to send you a link to Schema Design, where you can see some of the projects that he's done that really are fascinating from many different perspectives. For example, the tracking of congressional legislation is a great project. Really, really great project considering today as well in particular. So I'd like to do that if everyone agrees. If you don't want to receive the follow-up, just let me know privately and I won't do that. But it's very interesting to see that, as well as answering some of the questions that you had earlier that we weren't able to answer, like units and how many people it serves and such and so forth. Okay. All right, everyone. Well, if we were in a real lunch, I would say, okay, cookies and coffee. We are not.
Yeah.
So I will leave it at that.